This is Corinne.
And this is Ayani.
And this is Sex, Love, Literature, a pop culture podcast.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Sex, Love, Literature. This is our first episode of 2021, so Happy New Year again. We are super excited to be continuing our little podcast into this new year. Corinne, how are you feeling at the start of 2021?
I'm good. I have done exactly zero work on my dissertation because I had decided to take a break for the holiday, and I'm glad that I did. How about you?
Here. I've done the same. I felt like these last 2 weeks, Christmas, New Year weeks, I was like, I think we need to rest our brains and recharge and not be thinking about dissertations or articles or anything like that for a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Which actually is leaving me kind of feeling good right now. I think, who would have thought that taking a break could help recharge you? Who would have thunk it? Though admittedly, like, doing stuff for the podcast these last couple of weeks has been really nice. And in that vein, if you want to continue to support our little podcast, make sure to follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. If you just search Sex Love Lit, we'll show up in all of those places. And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite listening platforms. We actually just got added, I saw the email a couple days ago, to the iHeartRadio app now. So there's yet another place that you can listen to Sex Love Lit. So yeah, I'm really excited to be recording our first episode of this new year because we are talking about Bridgerton. So, quick aside, I know we promised that we would talk about Schitt's Creek.
But it turns out that we are liars, including to ourselves.
So, we called an audible because we had a lot of thoughts watching Bridgerton and powered through it in 2 days?
I think it took 3.
So many days. Three, so many days.
3 days and a couple drinks.
Oh, yeah, it was stressful. But we will come back to Schitt's Creek. That's kind of a little surprise for you guys this month is we're actually going to do 2 episodes. So while this Bridgerton one has come up first, you will be getting Schitt's Creek a little later in the month. So rejoice, 2021 brings presents for you, even though it's after the holiday season. But yeah, so Bridgerton.
Okay. So to tell you a little bit about the show, in case you have not been a part of the discourse, there has been a lot of Twitter discourse about this show. But to introduce you to it, if you haven't seen it, Bridgerton is a Shondaland show on Netflix. It's the first scripted show from her Netflix deal, and it's based on the romance Bridgerton series by Julia Quinn. The show was created by Chris Van Dusen. We got season 1 made up of 8 episodes, which dropped on December 25th. And I also kind of a note I think that's useful about this TV show is it's rather than just being like an 8-hour long movie, each episode did have the feel of an episode.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Like it had like a contained story. Like this was, I got this from Linda Holmes from NPR, a pop culture critic from NPR. And one of her things about, I think, Bridgerton was that it's made by people who know how to make television and are not just taking a singular story and stretching it out. But
okay.
So the premise of Bridgerton, it's set in 1813 in high society in London. Basically, it's like Gossip Girl, but in the Regency period. So this season is largely based on the first book of the series, which is called The Duke and I, and focuses on Daphne, the 4th oldest Bridgerton sibling and the oldest girl, and her romance with Simon, the Duke of Hastings. And a big thing about Bridgerton is that there are these gossip letters or a gossip column published by Lady Whistledown, an anonymous author, where she spills the tea on everything going on in London society. And although we do find out Lady Whistledown's identity in the series, we are not going to spoil that for you until later in the episode, at which point we will give you a heads up. We are going to have some spoilers about plot events, but that is the one thing that we don't want to spoil for you if you haven't seen it yet.
Yeah, so we'll definitely give you a lot of heads up before that comes. And it is on me to introduce the characters, which is a feat because this is quite an ensemble cast that we have working with, partially because there are 8 Bridgerton children, 8 of them. That is a lot of babies. They're not so much babies anymore, but
some of them are.
Some of them are. Some of them are still very, very young. So I'm tasked with introducing some of them to you. So our first is the Viscount Antony, who's played by Jonathan Bailey, who is the eldest Bridgerton sibling. Since their father passed away before the start of this show, I'm not exactly sure what the timeline is for that. Antony is kind of stepping in as the head male of the family, so taking care of business aspects of things, the money, the finances, etc.
And he has the title.
Yeah, and he has the title. As a note, as I'm running through all of these, it's tough to kind of remember who's who and what order they come in, but the Mama and Papa Bridgerton named everyone in alphabetical order. From A to H, I think. That's 8, right? Yeah, counting. Yes. I can do that. So if you're ever confused about who falls where on the line or which Bridgerton sibling we're talking about, just keep in mind, A is the first one, and so on down the line. Our next is Benedict Bridgerton. I like a good alliterative name, played by Luke Thompson, who is our second son. That means he gets a little extra freedom, which we'll talk about a little bit. Third is the sweet baby Colin, played by Luke Newton. Fourth, of course, is Daphne, played by Phoebe Drivner. I hope I'm saying that right.
Denever.
Denever. That was very wrong. I was wrong. Phoebe Denever. The fifth child is Eloise, played by Claudia Jessie. Eloise is our I don't want to get married, I want to be a woman of letters and go to school character, who, based on conversations with some of my friends, people find a little bit annoying. But we can talk a little bit about her, too. And then there are 3 more Bridgerton children, which we will not really be talking about in this podcast. Their mother is Lady Bridgerton, who's played by Ruth Gemmell. She's widowed, as I said, and a lot of her story is kind of about how... One is kind of her power struggle with Antony in running the household, but also trying to help Daphne be prepared for high society, finding a good match and all that. So that's the Bridgerton brood. We also have Simon, the Duke of Hastings, played by Regé Jean Page, who is a looker, to say the least.
To quote Andrew, Aoni's husband, Andrew, who had not been watching the show with us, was there when we started, I think, episode 3, and saw Simon and was like, that motherfucker is unreasonably attractive.
And in talking with some of my other friends, we've been trying to pinpoint exactly what makes him attractive, and we've decided it's just the whole package, everything. He's just wonderful.
We also have the Featheringtons, who are another big family that we follow. They have 3 daughters who come out in society. We're only really going to talk about one of them, and also the show really only cares about one of them, and that is Penelope. She's played by Nicola Coughlan, and of Dairy Girls fame. She is delightful.
Oh, yeah, she's great.
They also have sort of a ward, a neighbor, for reasons. They're also sponsoring Marina Thompson, who is played by Ruby Barker. We also were, although we're not going to talk about her that much, we're also extremely fond of Lady Danbury, played by Adjoa Ando. I
want to be Lady Lambury when I grow up.
Lady Danbury?
Larry Danbury. I can't talk today, apparently. It's fine. I'm just recording a podcast, but can't use my mouth. It's fine. It's fine.
But she's a mother figure for Simon, whose parents have died. And she's just all around delightful. Would you like to do your shout out, Aoni?
Yes, I do want to do a quick shout out to Martin Zimhangbe, who plays Simon's friend Will, because he is fantastic, and I really enjoyed watching him in this show. And I know a lot of people have really kind of been thirsty for Simon over the course of, I guess, my reading of the Bridgerton discourse, but Will, thumbs up. That's, yeah. top tier boxing gentleman. I'm here for it. And yeah, we'll leave it at that.
And then last but not least, we have the inimitable Julie Andrews as the voice of Lady Whistledown, the author of the Scandalous Society newsletter.
Mm-hmm.
And she's delightful. She's having a ball. She sort of works as the narrator of what's going on in the show. She provides a lot of like the bridges that tie different stories together, and all around a delight.
Yes, agreed. There is a lot going on in Bridgerton, and part of the reason that we wanted to talk about this show is that it definitely, in a lot of ways, falls at the crossroads of our interests. Me doing a lot of study of how sex is depicted, more specifically in comics and animation, but how sex is depicted, how we're looking at it, how we're viewing it. And of course, Corinne's conversations about how young people are introduced to sex, thinking about consent, thinking about how stories are used to introduce conversations of sex. This was just kind of an amalgam of a lot of things that we're interested in. No monsters, but like, that's okay. Monsters don't have to be in everything. So we were definitely drawn to Bridgerton. Even before we watched it, just watching the trailers, we were like, oh.
Also,
and then,
like, I've always loved a good Shondaland show.
Very fair. Honestly, this is my first Shondaland show that I've watched from beginning to end.
Well, it's not over yet.
Oh, very true. Well, I jumped on the train at the beginning, let's say, because I watched a handful of Grey's Anatomy. There was like a year that I was really into it and was watching it live. And then my dad actually got really into the one with Olivia Pope with the name
Scandal.
Thank you, Scandal.
I watched so much Scandal. I think I gave up for the very last season, but they like jumped the shark long before that. But like I held on, and then I saw how it ended and was like, absolutely not.
Well, to be fair, I've only watched like a season and a half of Scandal, so I fell off long before the shark was jumped. But I have that kind of frame of reference. And then I never watched How to Get Away with Murder, but I love Viola Davis.
I watched like the first 2 seasons and maybe a little bit of the third, but they kept murdering people.
Well, yes, it's in the title.
Like they get away with murder in the first episode, and then they're like, I guess we should do it again. And
I mean,
why?
Because you got away with it. Now you just gotta keep murdering, right?
Gotta keep. Well, there's no murder. No, there is murder here. There is murder in this show. In Bridgerton. There's less murder here.
Oh, yeah, significantly less murder. So kind of looking at the Shondaland filmography, we're getting something a little bit different with Bridgerton. In that it is, one, not a contemporary story, right?
Although I think still Star-Crossed might have been a Shondaland show. It wasn't nearly as famous as the other ones, but it was like a summer show on ABC, and it was sort of set in like Shakespearean. It was like after Romeo and Juliet had happened, like after they dead with some other people. But one of the things I really liked it. It got canceled after 1 season. Not very many people really liked it. But one thing that was interesting about that show is that the main character was a dark-skinned Black woman, and like one of the criticisms of Bridgerton is that although there are a lot of Black people, a lot more than in most Regency shows, none of them are particularly dark-skinned.
Except for Will. Well, Lady Danbury too.
But they're still lighter-skinned.
Yeah, that's fair. I guess compared to like Simon and Alice. But okay, yeah, I see what you're saying. That's interesting. I haven't seen any of that critique, but I believe you.
I've seen some of it, I think, particularly from Ebony Elizabeth Thomas, who is a famous children's literature scholar.
Ah, okay. Interesting. Yeah, this show has definitely been very talked about, let's say, in a lot of different ways.
So what are your expectations for a Regency romance, Ayani? Because I think part of why this show got so much discourse is because it subverted a lot of people's more traditional expectations.
Yeah. So I honestly do not have a lot of experience with Regency romance stories. I think the one that I have maybe a little bit of experience with is like a Downton Abbey kind of, Jane Austen, you know what I mean? So I don't know, big poofy dresses, people being witty, but not exactly saying what they mean, kind of lack of conversation around sex, maybe like dancing around conversations of sex, but not actually being direct about them. I clearly don't have a lot of experience with Regency romance stories. What do you expect though? Because I know you're somebody that has a lot more experience, for lack of a better word, with these kinds of narratives.
Before I became a person who exclusively watches Korean dramas, I used to watch a lot of British television. So, like, I've seen, like, most of the Jane Austen adaptations. I've seen, like the Pride and Prejudice minis. I've seen, like, all the versions of Pride and Prejudice, all the versions of Sense and Sensibility. I've also seen some of the more obscure BBC ones, like Wives and Daughters, and as well as, like, Downton Abbey and North and South, and I've seen a lot of them, and I think one of the reasons Bridgerton got so much attention is because it is, well, two reasons. A, it's a lot spicier. I think it is in some ways more similar to Downton Abbey in the way that Downton Abbey, I think, had a little bit more with sex, especially with Mary in the first season. But Bridgerton then kicks it up a notch even more. But another reason that it got a lot of attention, and from some naysayers, maybe some more negative attention, is that it does specifically have people who aren't white in it.
Yeah. There are a lot of people of color in this cast. Mainly, I mean, I'm not to make a little bit of assumption, but a lot of Black people in the story, you know, from the Count or the Duke to Lady Danbury. There are just a lot of Black faces in it. Honestly, which is one of the reasons that I was more interested in watching Bridgerton, you know, because normally in these kind of stories, you don't see people that look like me, you know, especially not as royals or that's right, the Queen is also a Black woman, you know, so not as royals, not as people in positions of power in this kind of time period. So I know that was something that really drew my attention when we watched the trailer the first time.
Well, and another thing that I really like about it, and that I think bears, I don't know, pointing out maybe or emphasizing, is that, like, even in, and maybe especially in all of, like, the Jane Austen adaptations and that whole world, the version of Regency England that we see is already a fantasy.
Right.
It is not ever strictly historically accurate. And I think Bridgerton sort of leans into the reality that our version of this is imagined, and it is meant for people here in 2021 and not actually for people in 1813.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. Like, I think the fantasy aspect of Bridgerton is something definitely worth highlighting and kind of focusing on. That even, I mean, this might sound a little silly, but even in the choice of colors, how things are portrayed.
It's such a beautiful show. Like, the costumes are so delightful.
Oh, they're gorgeous. They're stunning. But even there's a sequence that I'm recalling when they go back to Hastings, the Duke of Hastings manor, and there's a shot of them on this gorgeous, beautiful lawn, and everything is so very green and so very blue. It feels like the kind of thing that would be plucked out of a fantasy retelling. You know what I mean? So even in how they shoot Bridgerton, it feels like they're shooting kind of a fantasy narrative, you know? So yeah, I think calling it a historical fantasy, if we're going to kind of think about conglomerate genres. I know sometimes we run through the different genres that something can fit into, but I definitely think thinking about what historical fantasy means and how it can apply here is really, I don't know, a smart thing to think about, you know?
Well, and building on that a little bit, and the reason Bridgerton is specifically interesting to us in the context of this podcast is there is so very much sex.
Oh my gosh, so much. Like, we'll come back to this, but I was literally yelling at the TV because of how much sex there was. Oh man, yeah. So there was actually an article, just kind of to lead into this, that you sent to me from the LA. Was it the LA Times?
Yeah, I think it was the LA Times.
That was asking how true to history is Bridgerton, right? And a quote from that article, and I think they were quoting a scholar here of the time period. But we know that the Regency society was a very bawdy society generally. Extramarital sex is no longer illegal. Most adult consensual sex is within the law. There's a very open culture of prostitution in London, and we get celebrity courtesans and mistresses. So it feels like in a way it's kind of building on some of the actual historical knowledge that we have about the Regency, but then putting it, as you were saying, in a very 21st century sensibility, if that makes sense, for 21st century audiences. So yeah, let's talk about the sex, Korean. Yeah. So I guess we'll start here because it's kind of at the top of our list. But one of the things that really stood out to me were some of the cinematic choices in terms of how sex was shot and how we were shown these sequences. So this is, to say the least, this is where the spoilers start happening, right? Because we're talking about who's sleeping with who, and how that you can't talk about sex in abstraction, I think, in terms of this show. But when Daphne and the Duke start sleeping together after they're married, after they're married, right? We have so many sequences of them having sex in different places at different times of day, spurred on by different things that turn them on, right?
There's so much of it.
There's so much. There's so much sex. At one point, I literally yelled, what was I just saying? If they just stopped fucking so much and had a conversation, like, we would have so many less problems. But thinking about the first time that they have sex.
So, for a little bit of context.
Of course.
So this Bridgerton focuses largely on Daphne coming out. And by coming out, I don't mean coming out as gay. I mean coming out into society. And she has a ruse with the Duke where she, for Lady Whistledown reasons, isn't getting the attention that she wants and needs in order to secure a good match. He's getting too much attention because he is a Duke and
single.
He's a single Duke and he's determined not to marry. But then they pretend that they're courting and both get a lot of attention, or he succeeds in not getting attention. She gets a lot of attention. They fall in love. For reasons, they have to get married. Both of them think the other one doesn't actually want to get married, but then they
realize they do.
They realize they love each other, and it also gets complicated because the Duke doesn't want to have children, and she does, and it's a whole mess that we will come back to. But on their wedding night, when they have sex
for the first time, yes, now we're caught up. There were definitely some interesting cinematic, I guess, camera decisions or editing decisions in depicting that sex sequence. So I know the one that jumps out to me is there's a moment where the camera pulls back from them sleeping together, and we're kind of looking at them, I feel like over a chair almost. I remember there being a chair in that sequence, but we are kind of away from them. And then everything gets fuzzy. And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Corinne, but you and I both had the same kind of reaction that we thought that meant the scene was done.
Well, like, it specifically reminded me, I think it was like maybe through a screen or something that was separating us from them.
That's what it was.
And it reminded me of a little bit of an older movie called Stardust, where in that movie, when Tristan and Yvain, it's just a PG-13 movie, so it's not nearly as explicit as Bridgerton, but when Tristan and Yvain start to, like, go at it for the first time, we like zoom out and then go like through the screen. So like instead of like looking through it and then like, and then it like, I guess goes out of focus, and then we pan down to another location so that that's how we know that they're carrying on, but we are not watching. But instead of us leaving, it goes back to them having sex.
Yeah, and then we're closer too. So we go from this moment of being kind of away from them, separate from them behind the screen, to being like right in their faces, if I remember correctly.
Or their butts.
It was either their faces or their butts, but somewhere we are suddenly very close to them. There are a lot of butts in this show, by the way. So many butts. But we're suddenly very close to them. And it made me, I don't want to say it pulled me out, but it made me really think of the cinematic language of sex, if that makes sense. How both you and I expected the sequence to be done after we had this fuzzy fade, but then we weren't done and we were like really, really in it. So,
and it's not like we hadn't seen that much up to that point. Like, we've seen like both of them get like all the way naked. Like,
there was a clear, we knew sex was happening. So throwing this question at you, like, did you find it jarring? What do you think they might have been trying to do there with moving from this kind of fuzziness to being like in your face about it?
I don't know. That's a good question. Well, like, I'm thinking about who you are watching the show with, because I know like we were watching it together and that was fine, but like one of my friends was watching with her parents and that was way too much for them. Side note, I do not recommend watching the show with your parents. Don't do it.
Or your children?
Or your children. Unless, I don't know.
You know what? Let me not pass judgment. You're absolutely right.
But like, I don't. So like, also when we were watching the sex scenes in this show, the two other shows it made me think about. One is sort of thinking about these period pieces that have more explicit sex in them, because in so much of it, like peak romance in Pride and Prejudice, the 2005 Pride and Prejudice, is like Mr. Darcy holding Elizabeth's hand when he helps her into the carriage, like, and that's like as spicy as it gets. So like, shows that get a little spicier that I was thinking about are Outlander and The Great, which we've talked about on this show.
Yes. Good old The Great.
In which like the sex is a lot more explicit. And it almost, so I think, I haven't seen all of Outlander. I've only seen, I think, the first season and a couple episodes of the second. But the wedding night episode of Outlander is one of my favorite episodes of television, because it is so, I think, careful in how it presents sex. And it does present sex explicitly, but it's almost more careful about how it does it. And in that show, Claire is she's been gone back in time. Anyway, the plot's not important, but she's not a virgin, but Jamie, her new husband, is. And in this show, Daphne is a virgin and the Duke isn't, and has a bit of a reputation for sowing his wild oats, although he doesn't want children. So I guess he is not. He's almost sowing his wild oats. I can't talk.
It's okay. Neither of us are very good at talking today, apparently. So I guess technically not sowing his wild oats, as it were. And I kind of want to throw a little bit of context. I know we're talking about kind of the cinematic choices, but something I think that's worth noting is that he and Daphne have a conversation about sex while they're still kind of in their ruse phase of things.
And it's also to make it like Daphne doesn't know what sex is.
Right. Yeah. And of course, we're going to come back to this a little bit later, because I think both you and I had some thoughts about how sexual education, or the lack thereof, is kind of played around with in the show. But Simon and Daphne have a little bit of conversation about masturbation.
Well, and it's specifically in the context of like, what is marriage for? And Daphne is asking Simon this. And at this point, they're friends, sort of.
Yeah, friends.
And it's clear that she's sort of getting as audience members, it's clear she doesn't know what sex is. The answer to her question is sex. Simon knows the answer is sex, but he can't tell her that.
Right.
So he ends up telling her about masturbation
instead. Sorry, I'm more laughing at your reaction. That was great. Actually, so in thinking about that sequence and how they're talking to one another, and again showing his level of understanding and level of expertise as opposed to her naivete,
and that also I think demonstrates his then understanding of what she does not know.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Kind of cueing him into how clueless she is about this. It kind of makes their wedding night sequence all the more interesting, because we know how inexperienced she is. We know that he knows how inexperienced she is, but it still kind of ends up being a positive experience for the both of them. And I think the camera work and how it's shot and how it's filmed, how it's lit even, does a lot of work to kind of show how it is a positive experience. Though, again, talking to a friend of mine, we were laughing and we were like, media has a tendency of making everyone's first time seem so wonderful.
I mean, I think one of the reasons it does sort of zoom back in after we thought it was done and it wasn't is, I mean, to put it explicitly, like, Daphne has an orgasm.
Yeah.
Her first time. I remember you saying, like, when that happens, like, oh, now she's going to think it's that great every time.
Oh, no, my old lady cattiness is coming out.
But I think that's interesting to think about in what this show is. It's also presenting, I think, a fantasy of what sex is like.
Right.
As well as
absolutely.
a fantasy of what the Regency period is like.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's a great way to put it, kind of a fantasy of what sex is, what it's like, and what it can be. I hadn't thought about it that way. I think that's really bright. But thinking about kind of the fantasy of sex, one of the things that we picked up on was kind of the voyeuristic nature of these sex scenes, how in order for them to be a fantasy, they have to be a fantasy for somebody, right? And that's for the viewer. It's for the people that are watching. And something that we thought was interesting that we wanted to think on a little bit is how there are actually a variety of different kinds of sex scenes in Bridgerton. Of course, we have kind of Daphne and Simon going at it constantly. Constantly. What was that episode?
Everywhere.
Like 5 or 6?
Like in the office, in a field, against a tree. I don't know. Like, only occasionally in a bedroom. Like,
right.
I don't
we
know.
saw Simon's butt so many times. And this is the second time we talk about man butts on our podcast after Lucifer. It's actually, as a really quick aside, it's interesting how many connection points to other series that we've talked about are here, because there's that kind of connection to Lucifer with how we view the man's body in Bridgerton. There's kind of the Regency sex connection with the Great, because there was a sequence when they went at it on his desk in the office that for my brain went right to the Great when I was watching that. When the workers in the house were listening to them from behind the doors.
They were so inconsiderate of their servants in this show.
Very much so.
After Downton Abbey, where the servants are like equally developed characters, and in here they're just like, they're not 100% props, but they're just enough not props for me to be so uncomfortable for them.
Yeah. And they were like that in the Great too. The poor like people that worked for them were constantly just like, we're just gonna be
like
here.
In the Great, Peter is supposed to be like kind of a dick, and Simon and definitely also a dictator. A lot of problems with Peter, but like in this show, we are supposed to like Simon and Daphne. So when they aren't faithful to their servants, it made me more uncomfortable. Because like, of course, Peter is an asshole to his servants. Peter is a mess, but like, Simon and Daphne aren't supposed to be.
Yep, but they start going at it when people are there. But
so rude.
Beyond Simon and Daphne and their constant fucking all over the place, all over all of the furniture. I'm surprised I didn't do it in the kitchen, by the way, or in the dining room or wherever the fuck else. But there are also sequences of masturbation, and there's an orgy sequence in which second son Benedict has a wild time at an art.
It's like an artist party, but
an artist party.
But it has a mix of people from the upper class and people from not necessarily like the lower class, but like the modiste, the dressmaker is there, and like people and like performers, like actresses, and that level of society is also there. So it's for largely, but not exclusively, men of the upper class, and perhaps a handful of married women who have more freedom, but not unmarried upper class women. Right,
exactly. And kind of comparing these sequences of self-love, couple love, and everybody love, it was very interesting that the masturbation sequence in particular made me a little like, oh, okay.
It made both of us uncomfortable. Is that when we needed a drink?
No, I think I needed a drink when she and Simon started like going at it before they were married in the dark garden, and I was like, I had to stop it and walk away because I was like, I can't. We ended up drinking sparkling cider, so it wasn't quite a drink.
I had to drive later. We're very responsible.
But the masturbation sequence, because of I think how voyeuristic it was, made me the most unsettled, but not in a way that I'm like, oh, that means it shouldn't be there. Like, I'm not of that mindset.
Unsettled, not scandalized.
Right. And it was important for Daphne's like character maturation and all of that kind of stuff. It was the scene had a reason for being there. I'm not saying like, oh, masturbation, right? Whatever. But I think because one, it was about her first exploration of her own body, coming from a place of no knowledge to a place of some knowledge. And then on top of that, she was fantasizing about Simon while touching herself.
I think it's interesting as well that they were using these like brief shots of like her time with Simon, like when they almost held hands. I don't even remember, but like up to that point, their interactions had been really, I want to say innocent. I don't know that that's exactly
more friendly, more friendly,
and also very chaperoned, very in public. So like the things that she was using to fantasize about, that it was flashing back to for us, were interesting, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think they were very interesting. It was just kind of this deep dive both into a private moment in which she had locked the door and tried to keep everyone else out, but we were watching, but then also peering into her private thoughts made it kind of unsettling for me, which oddly enough was the complete opposite reaction I had to the orgy sequence in which everybody was just having sex on the stairs. I think because it was not shot as intimately. We always maintained a sense of difference from all of the different people that were having sex. And even when Benedict was with, I guess, the modiste and someone else's wife, I'm forgetting the artist's name, but a married woman of the Tom, we never got too close to them. There was never like the extreme close-ups like with Daphne and Simon. I think if anything, the closest we got was from like a chest up, if I'm remembering correctly.
I wonder if there's also, maybe not for you, but for me, something about it as well is that like everyone at the sex party knew what they were doing, was there with fully informed consent.
Yeah.
And also knew that whatever they were doing, they were also doing very publicly.
Yeah. I think public isn't actually an interesting choice of words there, because it was still a private space, but it was a private space to be viewed by others, if that makes sense. It's not like this was in the street. They were still behind closed doors from the rest of quote unquote polite society.
But they were still in crowded rooms.
Yeah. So I think you're absolutely right that there was already that expectation of viewership in that space. So I was just one of many sets of eyes, rather than in Daphne's masturbation sequence when there are supposed to be no other eyes that are there. So yeah, that was just something that I found really interesting. Go ahead.
And then maybe building on that a little bit, we also we have the scenes with Daphne and Simon together, which like I think was a little bit voyeuristic, particularly on their wedding night. But like as they started having sex everywhere, every which way, that felt less and less intrusive as time went on, because it was like they were essentially not in public in the same way, but like when they're making eyes at each other in front of the servants, like they're not being private either.
No, yeah. And also perhaps the fact that it was consistent, right? It wasn't in Daphne's sequence alone, that was the only time we ever saw it. While Simon and Daphne, again, I can't remember if it was episode 5 or 6, but like every 2 minutes, we were getting them having sex in another place, doing something else, experimenting in another way. There was just this constant flow of them having sex, so it's not the same kind of, not desensitization, I don't want to use that word, but like we got more used to it. There was,
and also like as Daphne also got more used to it. I think it's also maybe worth mentioning here, although they are not the main focus of this season, Anthony and his opera singer mistress Sienna.
She's so gorgeous.
Oh, she's gorgeous, but they obviously have a very fraught relationship because Anthony is the Viscount and she is an opera singer, and basically she's a kept woman,
right?
And that's how she makes her living. But like because we see them having sex in the first episode,
right?
But like
that was actually Anthony's introduction, was seeing him having sex with Sienna. But
yes, but like Sienna, I think maybe part of why that didn't. I mean, that was also part of, I think, setting viewer expectations for what the show would be like. But also, like, Sienna is very, like, she needs to be more careful with her feelings, but she knows what she's doing when it comes to sex. Whereas with Daphne, I think seeing people learn about it is something that I am always very, very wary of, because coming from a place, it's like this transition that we talk about a lot in children's literature and childhood studies, from innocence to experience. And there's this like particularly when we're thinking about sex, there is a difference between innocence and knowledge, and knowledge and experience. And like particularly with Daphne, like she was going from a place of innocence to experience without knowledge in between, which I think is one of the things that made me so uncomfortable.
So let's sit with that for a second, actually, and think about how sex education, or the lack thereof, is working in Bridgerton. Because the lack both of knowledge that women have about sex and the lack of wanting to actually provide that knowledge is something that's really hit on here in Bridgerton. We have Penelope and Eloise, who are shocked to find out that, well, Penelope tells Eloise that it's a maid, but Marina is pregnant outside of marriage.
And as a reminder, Marina is their daughter of one of their neighbors who is staying with them.
Oh, no. She's a cousin.
She's like a distant cousin.
Yeah. But there's some kind of family connection there. Because she's from a farm, I think. That sounds very vague, but like she's not from London. She, lives outside of the city. There's this sense of, from my understanding, that she can take care of herself kind ofness to her, that she's worked a day in her life kind of a thing. She's not just a pampered, woman about to go out for her debut sort of thing. But anyhow, Penelope and Eloise are scandalized that you can get pregnant outside of marriage because they have no idea what the process actually is for getting pregnant.
Well, and even like when part of how Penelope develops this sort of friendship with Marina is by trying to understand how pregnancy happens.
Right.
And even then, Marina, who has clearly become pregnant, doesn't feel comfortable giving Penelope all the deets on how that went down.
Right. And Eloise, I think, asks her mother where babies come from, in a very Eloise kind of way, where she comes in and she's like, well, I guess you don't have to be married to have a baby. And everybody's like, what? But her mother won't explain it. And her brothers start to joke about it. But then her mother is like, you guys are not discussing improper topics, are you? So there's even this sense that if her brothers wanted to impart that knowledge, polite society does not deem it appropriate, even within family bounds, even though they have full knowledge and understanding of how this process works. So it kind of speaks to the embedded power imbalance in sex in all of these relationships.
Well, and one of the things that article that we read mentioned, the one from the LA Times, is that part of maintaining these upper class women's innocence is part of what made them a valuable commodity.
Right.
Not necessarily because of fetishizing virginity in the same way, but you guarantee the lineage.
Right. That whatever child you're having is from this woman because she's never had a child before or had sex before.
And part of how they guaranteed that was the case is that, like, on your wedding night, sex was a surprise.
Surprise! And one of the sequences that really stood out to us in that regard was when Daphne was trying to talk to her mother about what she should expect on her wedding night.
This is after she's been married before she is married. It has happened. They are going to be having sex. This is on the docket. Yep. And her mom tries to tell her about it and gets too embarrassed and can't do it. And I was so mad.
Talk about it. Why are you mad, Corinne?
She talks about it's natural. You'll figure it out. Like, you remember those dogs we had? They figured it out, and then there were puppies. What? How is that enough? How is that a good sex talk?
Also, dog sex and human sex is very different.
That's the first time that Daphne, who is not an idiot, it's like, oh, so it has to do with having children then, and her mom's like, yeah, and that's the end.
I wish you guys could see Corinne's face right now because it's fantastic. But yeah, so a question again, and then I'm going to throw another question at you. Why spend this much time looking at these things and like really highlighting the lack of knowledge that Daphne and the other young women have about sex, right? Is because on one hand, I think that might be an assumption, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but in other Regency dramas and shows, that these women don't have this knowledge, right? That's kind of an assumed thing. And then, like with the Great, for example, we have Catherine, who's has her whole monologue about how sex is going to be. It's going to be rainbows and butterflies. And very quickly, I think within like the first or second episode, she learns, I should say, that that's not the case.
I think it's the first 20 minutes.
It's the first 20 minutes. Yeah, it was like that. But there's not that same kind of drawn out conversation about her lack of knowledge about sex. While sex is core and important to the narrative, it's not the same kind of like beating over the head of these women don't know, these women don't know, these women don't know. So what might be happening here or why?
So I think there's a couple layers. I think the first one is that it is this sort of expectation we bring to Regency and period series and shows that like women are kept in the dark. And part of that I think comes from our, I think, misunderstanding of like the Victorian era as super, super prude. And there's a lot of study of that and how that's like in a lot of ways a misapprehension that we have. But like that is something then that like your casual an expectation that your casual viewer will have. I think there's also an element of comedy to it, like we're supposed to find it funny, and I don't necessarily, but I guess I could see how some people might, as long as the women do not end up being the butt of the joke.
Right.
But then the last thing that I think it is trying to do, particularly remembering that any historical show, any historical fiction is not actually a commentary on that time, but is a commentary on the present.
Yeah,
I think
that's
they
important.
are trying to make a commentary on how a lack of sex education can be harmful, but I think that that commentary here ultimately lacks teeth.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't have enough bite to me. It's like, I get it. When you don't tell someone anything, then they do something stupid. But like, it's almost like too cursory for me in this drama to actually do anything salient.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. Especially since if we're thinking about this drama making a commentary on our current lived experiences, there's just so many different ways of gaining information that, I don't know, that wasn't accessible to the young women in this particular historical fantasy time period, that I can see what you mean by it not having teeth, or maybe being a little too far removed, perhaps, to make salient commentary. So, do we want to shift our tone a little bit? We've been doing a lot of giggling, but there is something, I think, a little serious that we need to sit with and talk about, that I haven't read a lot on, but I know I have very strong feelings on, is, I mean, just to be on the nose about it, is Daphne's assault of the Duke. That takes place, again, I'm forgetting episodes, and we just watched this, so I really have no excuse, but I feel like it was like episode 6.
6 seems right.
So do you want to give them the little bit of context, since that's your bag?
Yeah. So the context here is that when Daphne marries the Duke, he tells her that he can't have children, and she makes her peace with this, or thinks she does, but assumes that it is because he is infertile.
Right.
And that turns out not to be the case. It is because of some vow he made to his abusive father that the Hastings line would end with him and he wouldn't have children. And then as Daphne and Simon have been having all this sex, Daphne comes to realize that he has been pulling out, and she does not, because she doesn't actually know what sex is,
or how it works.
This has not truly been explained to her. She has had to learn by doing. It takes her a while to put the pieces together, but then once she does, she has sex with Simon again, and she gets on top and doesn't let him pull out.
Right.
He is distressed by this because he did not want to have children.
Right.
And I mean, honestly, when it comes down to it, the problem here is that turns it into, or potentially turns it into, a rape scene rather than whatever else has been going on before then.
Right. So I know the issue that I was having, and I know we've talked a little bit about this outside of, this direct podcast, but as she was putting the dots together. She goes to her lady's maid, Rose, and demands that Rose give her a complete understanding of how sex works in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And
also, to be clear here, she has a good relationship with Rose. This is not her bullying Rose into telling her.
Oh yeah, no.
That part is fine.
Right. But also Rose is still her lady's maid. So
there's still a power dynamic there. Yeah.
But with that express knowledge, now having a full understanding of, the semen is needed to make the baby, she then has sex with Simon, gets on top of him, and does not let him pull out because of what she wants. So to me, that was an explicit kind of denial of his consent in that circumstance. Mm-hmm. And again, one of the reasons that I kept yelling that if they just stopped having sex and had conversations, that a lot of these things would be worked out. It's just something that I think gets glossed over very, very quickly in a way, in that he's upset because, he doesn't want to have children and now she can potentially be pregnant, but not in the fact that she took advantage of Simon in that circumstance and used the knowledge that she gained explicitly to take advantage of him to get something that she wants. So in a way, I don't want to say it was a fumble because I think that might be too harsh, but the way that the story is told, I think it kind of overlooks the fact that she did assault him, Again, if we're making commentary on our current era and not the era in which this happened, she assaulted him. She denied him kind of the consent in that moment, Well,
and I think one of the reasons it sits so uncomfortably for both of us is that the narrative then spends a lot of time thinking about how Simon betrayed Daphne by saying he can't have children instead of that he doesn't want to have children, which is semantics, but I think is also a fair critique, but does not give the same weight to Daphne also taking advantage of Simon.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I know one of the things that we were saying back and forth is that when they started this relationship, perhaps in a way, Simon was taking advantage of her lack of knowledge, but also he then does say that he had assumed someone had explained this to her. So again, we kind of have the failing of sex education and communication in the time period of the narrative. So yeah, it was kind of a weird sequence in an otherwise, I don't know, lighter show that then was not given kind of the weight that, to speak for you, we felt it perhaps deserved.
Well, and also I think it's part of a larger cultural problem of only thinking about how consent matters for women and not for men. And while the vast majority of the time women are more likely to be sexually assaulted than men, that does not mean that men cannot be sexually assaulted.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And also thinking about, as you talk about all the time, the complicated nature of consent and how it's not always just a simple yes or no.
Yeah.
I was having a conversation with a friend about the sequence, and one of the things that she said was, well, he didn't explicitly say, no, get off me in that moment. And I'm like, yeah, but he was also about to come. So asking him to make full, complete sentences in that moment is a big ask. And he did say, wait. And there was definite hesitation there. And for me, it was the fact that she was doing this on purpose. She knew what he had been doing and then took advantage of that.
And I think I also here am willing to give, I'm not giving the writers slack because I think they should have handled this better. But within these circumstances, I think I'm more willing to give Daphne a little bit more slack than Ayani is.
Yeah.
Because I think it's not just that Daphne wasn't taught about how sex works by then expecting her to just figure it out on the job. Yeah. She also isn't really taught about how consent works. Her consent has never mattered. So for her to be able to then apply it, I think is also a big ask.
Yeah. And that's where I guess the conversation about consent gets a little complicated, but I don't want to say a pushback, but something I raised to that is she has these whole conversations about her consent to be married with her brother and him overriding what she wants and kind of her desires and consents in that moment. So it just feels like there's an echo happening there, even if it's not an intended echo of her pushing back against pushing back against Antony, making her marry that terrible man whose name I'm forgetting because he was terrible.
And he's only in like 2 episodes.
Yeah, versus her then kind of overriding Simon's consent of what he wants. So there is that kind of like narrative feedback that happens in that moment. So while I hear totally what you're saying, it still feels like she has enough concept of like, this is what somebody wants, and this is not listening or not, acknowledging what that person wants in someone else's own actions. So
So
I don't
all
know.
that to say, consent is messy, and I think messier than this show wants to admit that it is.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And in a way, it kind of gave me a little bit of grumbles towards the end. And obviously, spoiler, but the fact that they do end up having a kid, because so much of those next 2 episodes, because it is an 8-episode series, this happens in episode 6. By the end of episode 8, they have a child, is that a lot of the focus on this whole situation and them reconciling and coming back together is from Daphne's perspective. So we don't really understand how the Duke comes to terms with, one, this vow that he made to never have children, dealing with his reaction to how he's treated, his desire for Daphne, his want of a family perhaps, and then coming to the point where they're having a child. So in a lot of ways that didn't quite sit as well for me.
Well, they just brush it under the rug. Like, there's this, I think, assumption from the show that viewers will agree that, like, of course Daphne's right that they should have children. The Duke is being absurd, and I don't think that that's fair to him.
Right.
And part of this, I think, so something that Ayani and I have also talked about outside of the show is that we've also been watching a show, a Korean drama called Search WWW,
which is so good. Oh my god, I loved it.
But like in that show, there's, in the main relationship, the woman who is older than the dude, so then they're doing stuff with power dynamics there. But that show takes her choice to never want to get married very, very seriously.
Very seriously.
And not as like a defect. Whereas like I think part of the problem with Bridgerton is it assumes that we will agree that Simon not wanting to get married and then not wanting to have children as a character flaw.
Right.
And something that needs to be fixed and that Daphne can fix with her love. Oh, I hate that.
Actually, quick aside, something we forgot. Love. Speaking of love. There's a moment, I think this was in episode 5, and this is kind of rewinding to the idea of the fantasy of this narrative, the fact that there's a historical fantasy and the way that they're using, or the fact that there are a lot of Black folks in the narrative. There's a moment where Lady Danbury is talking to Simon about marriage.
Oh, I hated this so much.
And she makes this kind of comment that because the king has now married a Black woman, it opens up all of these avenues for Black people. And it is the power of love that has now allowed Black people to rise in station. And I was like, oh my God, I hate this.
It was so horrible.
I think in a way it kind of tries to brush over or overlook all of the variety of, let's just say, for lack of a better term, interracial marriages, relationships that have existed over the course of time, but have absolutely not fixed systematic racism. Like, I don't know. And also just the fact, like, I really did like this version of it was Charlotte, right? Queen Charlotte. I really liked this version of Queen Charlotte, but there was just something about kind of making it so on the nose. Like, look at interracial love. It's fixing problems. I was just like, I think there's just so much historical baggage. One, in the US, in the UK, as well as kind of conversations now, current conversations about race and race relations that just made that kind of, I don't know, in a way that was...
It was oversimplified.
Oversimplified.
And it was also a little bit too, I think, a wink, wink, nudge, nudge. About like, look, we're so clever. This is why we have so many Black people in our drama. And I know I would have preferred, I think, to just like, instead of providing this like way oversimplified explanation, to just be like, there's Black people.
Yeah.
Deal with it.
Like it's not something that needs an apology for or a reason for.
Yeah, it shouldn't have needed apology or explanation.
Yeah, Black folks can just exist in a historical fantasy. It can just be. So that was another thing. I think we both groaned audibly when that happened, you know?
It was so horrible.
And it came out of the mouth of Lady Danbury.
Yeah, why'd they put that in her mouth? How dare they? How dare?
How dare? How dare? Yes. Sorry, we forgot to talk about that earlier when we were talking about the fact that this was such a multicultural cast.
But I think it also does connect, like, in this ideology of the show, and maybe of at least an idea of romances in general. I don't think all of them are necessarily this simplistic, with this idea that love conquers all, whether that has to do with there being Black people in the aristocracy now, or whether that has to do with Daphne fixing Simon.
Right. Ugh. And I will say I never like the idea of it being a woman's job to fix their significant other. That always kind of rubs me the wrong way. And I think in a way they dodge that because Simon is such an affable, likable character. You know, it's not like he's beating her or anything like that. And she's like, my love will fix him. But I think you're right that there is that kind of undertone of like, her love will make him want babies and thusly everything will be great again. Which is also a bad plan, I will say. Like, but that's neither here nor there. Yeah. And so that kind of leads me to something that you and another one of my friends have talked about, is Daphne kind of as a character. Y'all didn't really find her that appealing or interesting?
Yeah, she's fine. She was so vanilla.
Okay. It is now... This might not stemming from my lack of knowledge of Regency stories, but is she vanilla in these kinds of narratives? Is it like, you know, she's witty enough and beautiful enough and talented enough, and that's kind of the standard? And is that the fault of the show, or is that more the fault of the kind of source material that we're pulling on? Because I'm half tempted to go and read this because I'm curious about how the story went from being, what is it, The Duke and I, to being kind of broken out in this 8-episode visual narrative. But like, is it because we're tired of these kinds of heroines, or is it Daphne specifically?
So I think for me, part of what makes Daphne a little bit less than compelling is that we are told that she is interesting and beautiful and whatever, and not really shown. Whereas like like a Pride and Prejudice adaptation turns on Lizzie being super compelling. And I think they wanted an Elizabeth Darcy kind of character, or Elizabeth Bennet who becomes Elizabeth Darcy. My bad. But like they wanted that kind of character and didn't. I don't know. They just like didn't back it up. We were just like the way we're introduced to her is in like when the young women coming out that season are being presented to the Queen, and the way like we're supposed to just believe that she's interesting because the Queen. What does she call her? Exquisite
or flawless or something like that.
And then we're just supposed to believe it, and she was fine. I didn't dislike her at all, but I was not compelled by her either.
Very interesting. Yeah, I mean, in a way, I don't think, maybe bothered is too strong a word, but like I thought she was fine too. I guess I believed it because they wanted me to, and I was like, okay, if I don't believe this, then it kind of causes the rest of the narrative to fall apart in a way. You know, because a lot of it spins around the fact that she is the diamond of the season. And if you don't believe that she's the diamond of the season, then the rest of the narrative doesn't feel like it works, you know?
Well, and I do think that it is interesting maybe to think about, when do you believe something is desirable just because you are told it is? Particularly, I think that's interesting to think about, like, in relation to Daphne and Simon's ruse, that, like, the other men of society believing that Daphne is desirable comes in part from them believing that Simon thinks she is desirable.
Right.
And, yeah, I mean, so it is a question I think that the show is interested in. I just didn't believe them.
So I will say, though, that I found her relationship with Simon to be very compelling. And when they started becoming friends and playing off of each other and having their jokes, that's when I was like, okay, I see how this relationship can work, more than them just being like, she's flawless, everyone loves her, you know? So I think having the two of them playing off of each other did really work for me.
Yeah, and I do think they did have believable chemistry.
Yeah. Do we want to... I had a feeling that this episode was going to run long because there was just so much to cover. But did we want to think about Marina and Colin or talk a little bit about Eloise, or do we want to get right into thinking about Lady Whistledown as a wrap-up?
I think maybe just Lady Whistledown.
Okay, so... folks, this is your spoiler warning. We are getting ready to think a little bit about Lady Whistledown and how she ends up working in the series and maybe some feelings that we have about her. So if you have not listened or not watched Bridgerton, I should say, now is the time to stop.
And then once you know who Lady Whistledown is, you can come back.
Yes. We hope you come back. But okay, so Lady Whistledown. At the very, very end of episode 8, we learn that Lady Whistledown is, in fact, Penelope Featherington. Which casts Penelope and all of her actions over the course of the series in a completely different light. Which, on one hand, is very, very interesting. Of course, Penelope is one of the front runners for who you might think Lady Whistledown is as you're watching, I think.
And also, like, as perhaps a reminder of who Penelope is, she's one of the Featherington girls, all 3 sisters of whom came out at once. She's Eloise's best friend. She's deeply in love with Colin, the 3rd Bridgerton brother.
The C.
But she also is, I think, a less conventionally attractive woman. She doesn't have any suitors of her own over the course of the season.
Or... I will say they want us to believe her the less conventionally attractive woman. That's on purpose with how they're costuming her, how her hair is supposed to be put together and all that, etc.
But she also, I think, is a pretty delightful actress. So she was someone who I did find compelling as a character, actually, through much of the show, because she is trying to figure out what the deal is with where babies come from.
Right.
Through the character of Marina. She's just more interesting, and I think
I liked her.
She has more going on.
Yeah, I liked her a lot. She was one of the characters I think I enjoyed following the most as we were moving through the show.
Well, and maybe part of it as well is that, like, what her problems were more interesting to me than too many men like me. What am I going to do if this prince asks me to marry him? How am I going to say no?
Also, real quick, the prince gave Daphne this absolutely beautiful, expensive-ass necklace.
She lost it!
She left it on the
terrace.
The terrace, and it disappeared. Like, that could be an heirloom. I would say that, like, your mama was such hot shit, a prince wanted to marry her and gave me this necklace, and now I'm giving it to you, baby. Like, what? But again, she was already wealthy, so maybe it doesn't matter to her, but poor grad student me was like, you need to go find that necklace, girl.
But, like, Penelope's family is also dealing with, I guess, poverty problems because her father has gambling issues. Her mom is, like, a nightmare. But, like, Penelope then, I think, is a much more compelling character, but I think we're also supposed to view her as pitiable.
Yeah, I don't know if I necessarily pitied her though.
But I know that maybe pitiable is going too far, but, like, I think we're supposed to feel bad for her.
Oh, well, yeah, there are moments where I definitely feel bad for her, but that's because I'm not more invested, but invested in her feelings. So it's not so much I'm like, oh, poor Penelope, but more like when things happen with Colin or when people are rude to her, I'm like, wow, that's fucked up. People are mean, you know, more than just like, oh, she's not I don't view her as like the Whoopi figure. She's not like she's not the puppy dog that gets kicked and everyone's like, oh, puppy dog. At least in my opinion, that's not how I viewed her. I thought because she was someone who was kind of like on the hunt for knowledge in a way, even though she had struggles and even though her family, or at least her sisters, were really mean to her, I don't think her mother was mean to her more than any of her other sisters, if that makes sense. I don't know. I still felt like she was on an overall positive trajectory, if that makes sense. But one of the things that I guess kind of frustrated me is when we realize that she is in fact Lady Whistledown, it means that she betrayed Marina because of her feelings for Colin. So to kind of to provide some context, we're gonna like do that every time we say we're providing context, but to provide some context, Penelope has been in love with Colin for God knows how long. We're led to believe that it is a one-sided, unrequited love kind of situation.
And also that Colin has no idea.
Yeah. He's a sweet boy. I don't think he's doing this to be cruel to her.
Mm-hmm.
But Colin doesn't know how Penelope feels about him. And Marina, through her conversations with Penelope, tells her, she knows that she's pregnant. She knows that that Marina has this man that she's in love with, this soldier named Sir George. And also that Marina, because of the circumstance that she's in, because Lady Featherington wants her to get married before she starts to show, going to...
I do think
go ahead.
Lady Featherington is correct that the more people know that Marina is pregnant, the fewer her choices will be.
Right, of course.
So she's trying to get Marina, and I think we're supposed to dislike Lady Featherington for this, but I also think Lady Featherington is correct that the best choice for Marina is to get married real quick before, so there is reasonable doubt about who the father of the child is.
Right. And to be fair, Lady Featherington tries to set her up with some real old crusty dudes.
That part's gross. I am not excusing Lady Featherington for that.
Though, quick aside, Corinne was like, I don't know. If I was in Marina's place, he looks like he's going to die soon. So maybe I'd just be a widow.
Well, because he's going to die soon. He wanted an heir. Lady Marina will provide one. There's already one cooking. I don't know what the problem is.
He's a crusty... No, all that aside, Penelope is in the know about Marina's situation. So when Marina has designs for Colin, because he's a good man, because he has the potential to move very quickly and marry her before these concerns come to light, Penelope is not for it, because she says Colin is a good man and he doesn't deserve this, but also because Penelope is in love with him, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Penelope and Marina have this moment where Marina kind of dashes Penelope's love for Colin on the rocks in a way, by pretty much saying, like, he views you like a sister. He doesn't view you as a woman like he views me, so you need to get over yourself. And after that happens, Penelope pretty much publishes Marina's business into the
next Lady Whistledown.
Right. So even though, and I will say, Penelope already told Marina that she would not tell anybody about these circumstances, that she would keep it private, she pretty much puts her love for Colin kind of above her fealty for her family and her relationship to Marina, and spills all of Marina's business. And I don't know, that ain't sit right with me. Like, I kind of understand why she did it to save Colin, so to speak, but in the process, she kind of ruined her entire family.
That's true, although, okay, that is absolutely true. I am not disagreeing with that. But I think it is also interesting to think about things that, like, Lady Whistledown wrote about the Featheringtons early on. Like, Lady Whistledown wasn't saying nice things about them.
Yeah, that's true.
Like, from the beginning. So I think it is interesting maybe to think about, I mean, I hope that Penelope is making a pretty penny from this.
Oh,
but, like,
yes.
she has not done anything to make her own life or the lives of her friends easier. Like, part of the reason, like, Daphne and Simon are having a rough time because of Lady Whistledown at the beginning. So, like, I'm not mad at Penelope being perhaps a little bit mean, but I do think it requires a rethinking of who Penelope is in order to incorporate that into how we view her as a character.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. So if you're rethinking Penelope, like, does this cast her in a somewhat different light for you? I mean, honestly, for one thing, it feels like she's not as naive as she's pretending to be to everyone.
I think she's a good watcher of people. And, like, so Eloise, the fifth Bridgerton sibling,
Bridgerton
is on this quest for a lot of the show to figure out Lady Whistledown's identity. And a lot of the things that Eloise considers, like, it has to be someone with connections, it has to be someone with time to do it, it has to be someone with, like, some sort of means. Like, all of these things, I think, are true. So, like, one of Eloise's theories early on is it is an older widow who, like, is at parties but overlooked, and or, like, I think that is, I think it's interesting to think about that and how that idea applies to Penelope, and perhaps how unmarried women both are limited in some ways but also can be underestimated.
I think underestimated is a good word, because in a way it almost feels like the show wants us to underestimate Penelope as the show goes on, because of how she's viewed by her family.
And by society. Like, Penelope is not, and none of the Featherington girls really are portrayed as desirable.
Right. Unlike Daphne, who is,
hot shit.
The cream of the crop. Right. Though, I will say, I noticed a shift in how Penelope was portrayed towards the end when she starts, like, speaking up to her mother and pushing back against Marina's plan. And it's all, of course, couched within the polite society, veneer, let's say. But when she calls the plan into question, when she's like, she makes a snide giggle and then is like, oh, I'm sorry, I just blah, 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 blah. It does kind of start to turn some of those expectations on their heads. Or like the fight she has with Eloise, it feels like perhaps the show wants us to consider that there might be unplunged depths to Penelope.
Well, and like, I do think it's perhaps, I totally believe that it's Penelope. That is believable to me.
Yeah.
I didn't call it, but I also wasn't surprised.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. And you know what? Thinking about the widow, by the way, because Eloise, it was always like, was going in the right direction, but then made a wrong turn, Because all of the things she said does add up to Penelope, as you said. But I think we were also supposed to be led by the fact that, or misled, I should say, by the fact that Julie Andrews was the voice of Lady Whistledown. So we were already kind of building our own mental image of who this person is supposed to be, which is not Penelope, right? It kind of takes us, it's purposeful misdirection, takes us in a different kind of way than we were supposed to go. But I will say one of the things I'm very curious of, now that we know who Lady Whistledown is, and we're going to kind of incorporate that knowledge into Penelope's character, is how this works in the next season. Because I'm assuming the next season will be greenlit because...
Yeah, as we record this, it has not yet been renewed, but based on the buzz, I'm pretty sure it will be, with just delays for COVID.
Right, of course. Because I forget if we said this in the beginning, but each of the novels in this kind of Bridgerton series focus on a different sibling. So I'm curious how, for example, if Eloise is the next one that
I think Antony
we're sitting
is supposed to be next.
Oh, Antony's next? Okay. But how our knowledge of Penelope and the way she kind of is making commentary on high society will then come to play in the narrative, right? Since the mystery of Lady Whistledown has been removed for the viewers, how then that then changes how the narrative unfolds, because we have knowledge that everyone else doesn't.
Yeah.
So that kind of feels like a good place to wrap up. But did you have any last kind of lingering Bridgerton thoughts?
So I know we made some critiques of Bridgerton in our discussion here, and most things should be critiqued, but we did definitely. I do want to reiterate that we did enjoy it overall, and while we have some hesitations, it was a fun romp. It's very bingeable.
Absolutely.
You should watch it. It's fun.
Yeah, and I will say I'm looking forward to the next season. I'm curious, how sex is going to work. I'm curious what new kind of twists and turns they're going to take, and what new characters will come into the fold, what old characters are we not going to be paying attention to anymore. Yeah, I think there's a lot to look forward to in season 2.
What character are you most interested in seeing how they develop in season 2?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, they did just bring back the F sibling from the Bridgerton clan, whose name I'm forgetting, but she was away for the entirety of pretty much this season, and they brought her back in at the end. So I'm curious who she is. I really want to know how Eloise and Penelope's relationship is going to change and evolve, especially since Penelope does or Lady Whistledown calls Eloise kind of like her worthy opponent, so to speak, at the end, saying that, there is someone who is kind of on my tail who who not so much that she'll find her out, but who's like a worthy opponent to be sparring against, so to speak. So how their relationship is going to be depicted, I'm curious about that.
And I think Eloise is who I'm interested in more generally, because I think in this season, Eloise was almost, and my friend Ritu made this critique, but Eloise was almost like your cookie cutter proto-feminist.
Right.
But why are the men character? But I'm hoping as we spend more time with her that she will get to have more layers and more development and become more interesting. And I think particularly as someone who I think will be very attractive, but also does not want what society wants to give her. I think watching her season where she comes out, I think will be very interesting. And I don't know if that'll be the next season or the one after that, but I got my eyes on Eloise.
Sounds good. All right. So that's what we're looking for with the next season, or next seasons, plural, of Bridgerton. But what did you like about the show? What did you think was interesting? Were there things that you had hesitations about like we did? Or was it all fine and roses and
were we too hard on Daphne? Were we too hard on Simon? Let us know.
Yeah, and of course you can let us know on any of our social media accounts, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Just search Sex Love Lit and it should come up. Yeah, I think we'll probably have our Pillow Talk post up about this relatively soon. I think I still need to get the one up for Happiest Season.
As a reminder,
that will be there.
As a reminder, our Pillow Talk posts are something we do on Instagram where we share anything that we meant to talk about but didn't, which I'm sure will somehow be the case despite the length of this episode. But yeah, come find us on Pillow Talk to let us know what you think about Bridgerton.
Yeah. Oh, and also something I realized. So if you didn't know, our podcast is through Anchor. There's ways to leave us voice messages if you go on Anchor. Yeah, which we can like incorporate into the podcast. So if you want to send us some love notes, if you have your own Lady Whistledown style takes that you want us to include in the podcast. You want to
spill the tea.
Yeah, go check on Anchor and leave us some voice comments. This was a thing that I didn't realize we had. But yeah, so since we usurped Schitt's Creek, our next episode, we promise, or maybe not, because as Quinn said, we're liars to ourselves sometimes.
I think Schitt's Creek might be our white whale.
But hopefully, fingers crossed, our next episode will be Schitt's Creek. But if it's not, we'll have a damn good reason. But yeah, this has been Sex Love Literature. We hope you had a great time, because we did. We had so many feelings and emotions. I think this is our longest episode to date. But yeah.
Thanks for listening, and come find us next time.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.